This is broadcast number 623. It's November the 14th, 1983, and it's Mae Brussell, KAZU FM in Pacific Grove, California. And we will discuss for about one moment what happened a year ago tonight. That's what we usually do. That was broadcast number 571, November 15th, 1982. I was talking about Mr. Begin, the Prime Minister of Israel, and how his wife was buried in the brown shirt, how they were part of the right-wing Zionists, the Beitar Zionist group in Poland. And in this past year, he's resigned. There had been a lot of scandals and pressures on Menachem Begin, so he stepped down from office at this time. There's an article by Alex Coburn in the Village Voice, a letter from Albert Einstein, December the 4th, 1948, warning about Menachem Begin. It was signed by Einstein and a long list of people in the United States telling about his work with Mussolini in Italy and his terrorism, and trained by the anti-Semitic Irgun, and how he worked with the fascists in Poland and Italy, was trained to murder, and so forth. There also was an item about Einstein in Nation magazine a few months ago, the FBI creating a dossier that Albert Einstein was responsible for the kidnapping of the Lindbergh baby. This is that revisionist history that's going to follow. The French had stories that Jews ate French children, and when all the dust settles down on the international fascism, we can have this wonderful story that Einstein moved to Hollywood to make the movie industry communist, and that he was part of the kidnapping of the Lindbergh baby. Nothing better than having an American hero like Charles Lindbergh and then a Jew like Albert Einstein, and try to link them together through FBI documents. So Einstein's name came up this year. Last year at this time we were talking about Ronald Reagan releasing the Hitler Papers, a list of 10.7 million members of the Nazi Party that he's sending back to Germany. And then this year we find out that the Los Angeles Police Department is filling documents of, and other police departments around the country, into Western Goals expensive computers, and they're going to, via Mr. Wigner and Nazis on the board of Western Goals, into the BND Nazi organization right now in Nazi Germany, the remnants of Nazi Germany, the Galen operation. So that there wasn't much difference or leave off of time of collecting names and data. So what they have on the one hand are the true blue Nazis, and then on the other hand they have the people who protest the anti-nuclear position and the that are for abortion or object to police brutality. They've collected these people into a category that they feed into computers out of Philadelphia, Washington, Chicago, all the major cities. Last week, I gave reference to two magazine articles coming out on the printed sheet. I put 1983, a minor correction. It's 1984. The Hustle will be out in 2 weeks. There's a story in there about Larry McDonald and the Flight 007. And then the magazine Rebel should be out next week. It's the anniversary of John Kennedy's death. And Larry Flynt said that it will be out by next week. He called me this week, Saturday night, told me I should be very happy and proud. He's very pleased with the article I did. I was happy to do it. It made me feel very good. And to summarize in 50 pages, 20 years' work, or the conclusion of 20 years' work, is more difficult than just writing some current news event to extract what you want. But luckily, in my own mind, it came together just the way I wanted it, and I was really happy. And for those of you who are long world watchers, some of you have been taking these broadcasts. I've been on the air, this is my 13th year. And if you're a world watcher, at least 5 years or longer, I'll send you a subscription to Rebel for your holiday gift, and you'll get one a week. It'll be similar to Newsweek and the Time magazine. But for all of you long listeners who've sent me books and articles and got a lot of filing cabinets for me, and David Emery, the copying machine, the IBM typewriter, a few people have really come across and done some wonderful things. A few people have done that, and others have sent clippings and articles and books and constantly feeding me information. So you will get a subscription to Rebel. And as soon as I know, I'll write down LA and I'll get that in the mail for you. If you've been, a listener and a supporter of Psychologically, it's important as any kind of money you can send is just saying, I believe in what you're doing. I want your tapes every week. I want to know what's going on in the world. And my way of saying thank you is to give you a subscription to that, and then we will share an article a week, and we can keep these things as well as on tape in the printed page. I mentioned last week the article in Penthouse, a brief mention of a book by Ashley Montague, The Dehuman Syndrome, that's coming out of McGraw-Hill. If you want to look up the details of that case for you serious researchers, January 21st, 1979, in the Los Angeles Herald is a description of the lawsuit over the brain surgery by Dr. Vernon Mark, the chief of neurosurgeon at Boston Hospital, and Dr. Frank Irvin, who's at UCLA at the present time. And it's that story of Leonard Keeley, Kille, and the electrodes in his head, and how he was damaged and made literally a vegetable, a brilliant inventor. And he complained that what they did to his head would interfere with his inventions at MIT and with his writing at Harvard, where he worked at Harvard University. So they put him into Boston Hospital and chopped up his brain. And if you want to look up that article and know the exact terminal man, the real terminal man, that's who it is. One brief item on DeLorean. There's quite a bit in the news. They're trying to find that missing money in Detroit. The Houston Post said documents seized during a court order may locate more than $18 million missing. They're trying to come up with that $17.67 million, that was earmarked for DeLorean car. And now they say that it may be at Chase Manhattan. Would you believe that? They've subpoenaed Chase Manhattan. Of course, Chase Manhattan is involved with Mark Rich and a lot of other money scandals, and they're trying to locate this money, and then part of it was supposed to have been in the Rothschild Bank as October 2nd, 1979. Now, the lead I had about that money was that it came from, the money went to Klaus Barbie to pay for the dope, and Barbie put it in Joseph Mengele's bank account in Zurich, Switzerland. For those of you who don't have that back broadcast, you could get it. But if there's anything John J. McCloy, who was president of Chase Manhattan Bank, and Henry Kissinger don't want, are the links of Klaus Barbie and Henry Kissinger to cocaine in South America. So the fall guy may be the Chase Manhattan. So a little accessories after the fact that Chase is, oh yeah, I just remembered that John DeLorean put some money in my bank in 1979. Is that the $17 million you want? That's an easy way out, but they have not explained the delivery in Zurich, Switzerland of the money that came from him that is missing, and so I'd like to know about that. There also is a story in the paper this week about Judge Newsom in San Francisco. It was written by Warren Hinkle, and it's about Justice William Newsom, Newsom, of the State Court of Appeal. And he works with the Irish group, the IRA, and he was entertaining a person, Owen Carron, Carron, of the strong Irish resistance group, the Sinn Féin, Sinnfein. And Carron was in San Francisco at a meeting with the IRA. He wasn't supposed to come to this country. He entered illegally. But one of the people working with him and helping him is Judge Newsom from San Francisco. The article's called Leprechaun Judge. Well, Judge Newsom is the fellow that worked with J. Paul Getty and Otto von Bolschwing to set up the corporation TCI that Helene von Dahm worked for in California. Judge Newsom was very much part of that organization. And Otto von Bolschwing, the Nazi war criminal, came to this country, to New Jersey, and did a lot of work with Otto Skorzeny in Ireland. And at the time of the John DeLorean story just a year ago last week, I had mention of the Irish connections of Arturkovich, the Nazi war criminal, who got an Irish passport and went through Ireland with John DeLorean. And also, not to confuse you, John DeLorean is on the board of Chris Kraft that owns 20% of 20th Century Fox, but the attorney for Chris Kraft is a Simon Rifkin that set up TCI. If that doesn't confuse you too much, there is an Irish connection to TCI, to John DeLorean, to Otto Skorzeny, to Mr. Arturkovich, who I suspected DeLorean was seeing down in Southern California. And Simon Rifkin is the common denominator also with Michael Sindona from the Vatican, so that the same Judge Newsom who worked with John Paul Getty, it probably still does, and Otto von Bolschwing, and Simon Rifkin, who is the middleman between DeLorean and TCI, the attorney for both. This same Judge Newsom is working with the IRA and is active in San Francisco and is going to Ireland and evidently works with them, the leprechaun judge. So the network of the TCI that was set up when Von Damme was put as the secretary to Ronald Reagan, and the network of people are still very active, and every once in a while their name surfaces in the news. One short item, quite a while back, several years ago, that I saved and never had on the air, and just because Ronald Reagan was in Japan this week, I thought I'd bring it up, and Kissinger's name is in the news. It was April the 2nd, 1981. Japanese give Henry Kissinger $48 million to form a new foundation. Those who work to form the foundation are Henry Kissinger, former U.S. Secretary of State. A Japanese group will contribute $48 million for a new foundation to improve ties between the United States and Japan. $48 million for Henry Kissinger just a couple of years ago. Larry Flynt calls me once in a while. I talk to him. I'm really concerned now that he's getting Rebel out. A few years ago, 1978, he got the LA Free Press, and it was all about the John Kennedy assassination. And then 1 month later, when he goes to Georgia, he was shot. I didn't know him at that time period. I've only known him recently. But in the last short time I've known, the last 3 months, certain names come up that he mentions to me, and every one of them has to do with the past conspiracies and assassinations that he's totally enclosed by these people. It's so dangerous, but you can't protect a person who's busy in a public life from every single person. But he mentioned having call or contact with Dr. Baden, one example, from New York City, and his wife. And I identified Baden as a dangerous man from the CIA, worked with the House Select Committee, a liar on the House Select Committee, protected those Nazi assassins that were publishing in Rebel this week. He is not separated from his wife by any fraction. They work together as a team in every sense. There's no such thing as a woman like that not knowing what he's doing. And anything they want to offer him or to contact him, this is the man that ordered the cremation of Rockefeller when I'm pretty sure he was poisoned in that little party he was having with these women, and whatever it was, if he wasn't poisoned, the autopsy should have been done, and he was cremated on orders of Baden, who wasn't even in New York, was in California at the time. Mark Lane was contacting him again this week. Mark Lane kept valuable information from him. He should never let him go to Atlanta, Georgia without bodyguards or vests or protection. Mark Lane came out of the woodwork on the anniversary of Kennedy's death, and I'm sure got wind through Don Fried and the whole network that he's ready to go some more on the Kennedy story. Chuck Ashman, the attorney, was in touch with him. Don Fried called from New York. Stay away. Tell Larry Flynt, stay away. Check the Frank Sturgis, Chuck Ashman connections. Anyone who has anything to do with the past assassinations. I don't know a lot of people, but any of those people. Larry Flynt has bodyguards. He's selective in his home, who comes in, who goes out. I would automatically hang up on anybody who had information and suppressed it 20 years. He mentioned another person in Texas he wanted me to talk to on the telephone, Mary Farrell. She's done research 20 years. I was in Dallas-Fort Worth, maybe 2 miles from her house, and wouldn't see her 10, 12 years ago. And he doesn't know what I know about Mary, and he says, call her. I wouldn't touch it with a 10-foot pole. No way. This woman has suppressed. What has she written? What has she done? How has she supported? She has an enclave at her house of Bernard Fensterwald from the CIA and Gordon Novell. Novell went and Rush Harp. Rush Harp went to visit her and told me all about the visit and not to link the two together, but he had a demise not too long after, and he had stuff from her house that Gordon Novell allegedly had, and he wanted me to use it on the air, and it came from Mary's house. And I said, I won't touch it with a 10-foot pole. You never heard me put it on the air. You never heard me quote it. That isn't how I get my research. I don't deal with these people. They do what they want, and I do what I want. But leave me alone, and I don't want to be with them. Gordon Novell, I had to explain to Larry Flynt, was wanted by Jim Garrison as part of the conspiracy with Clay Shaw and Guy Bannister and Oswald's doubles down New Orleans. And when he wanted to speak to the grand jury or testify, Novell fled to Washington and announced, I'm with the CIA, and went to Ohio to Rhodes, the governor, who was the one in charge of the Kent State slaughters, See, these people not only were part of the Kennedy thing, but blood and murders and things follow later with some of these people. And it's not just covering up the Kennedy. There's other deaths. It's like with Mark Lane. What about sitting out in the woods while 914 people are dying? I mean, how can you handle that or scream it, or why would you give up even talking about it? Why do you have to meet with these people? There's so many deaths that surround them. Their karma is so bad. Stay away from them. Any of you researchers, you can't gain anything from them. You lose a little yourself and you can lose your whole life. And Gordon Novell has been CIA. He works with G. Gordon Liddy and Mitchell Wirbel. I'm just mentioning 6 or 7 people that Larry's mentioned on the phone in the last 2 weeks. And I want to jump through the wall, you know. What good are all the bodyguards, all the protection? If anybody calls and you know that they have a history of covering up the past, they may be dangerous in the future and you don't know it, but you don't have to make the same mistakes twice. My favorite poem, probably of all the poetry I have, is Carl Sandburg's advice of a father to his son. It says how you make certain follies or certain mistakes, but you learn from it and you don't make the same mistake twice. Everyone can make a mistake, but you don't have to do the same ones twice. You don't have to walk in where people have a track record of working for the same kinds of Nazis that we're publishing and writing about. So my advice is stay away, please, and don't let these people get around you. As long as you're doing good work, what do you need them for? Now, one of the news items, I brought in about 20 news items, but I'm not going to get to all of them, was that Larry McDonald's widow, the grieving widow, was defeated in the elections last week. Well, Larry Flynt had a big role in that. He helped finance the person that opposed her. He felt that she was wrong, that she's narrow, she's prejudiced, a one-track mind, and he helped support the person in the electoral system and put his money where it belonged and stood up for what he believed. And what you have, all of you from coast to coast who tape these broadcasts, is not a representative with a narrow mind in a slot. The next person who takes her place may turn out to be Jesse Helms. You go after him next. But you don't let a woman into that place. She's on the communication with the CIA and the State Department while her husband's plane is allegedly hijacked or over an island. They haven't even gotten the president up. So you know she knows more than even the president of the United States about what happened to Larry McDonald, this grieving widow who didn't have time to cry. So it's really courageous to stop that election, and he did, and that's the kind of work that's important. We don't all have a lot of money to stop elections, but we do have a voice to say what we want, and it's up to us to get out there and do it and use what's available. And I think the system is a paper tiger. The times that I've seen it used, it worked. And that's one of the things that encourages me so much and doesn't discourage me to throw everything in and say, what's the use, is that there are situations that can be altered and we should use them. Now, I'm going in at length to just an outline of the work I've done on the Grenada affair, because the invasion of Grenada, because I've spent the last week, night and day, till the early hours of the morning and gotten it into a place where I can describe it, visualize it, and now begin to write a 2-part article on it. Last week I talked about the murders that were taking place before Mr. Bishop down in Central America and South America by the Central Intelligence Agency, before Mr. Maurice Bishop was murdered, how they were working, and how Lord Carrington, the co-partner of Henry Kissinger, was down in the Barbados making a deal as soon as Bishop was elected in 1979. That's when they decided he had to go. And then the military officials were slipped into place by Ronald Reagan for a military takeover. And I talked a little bit about the secrecy of the invasion, of the people in the mental hospital. And since that time, I've gone through maybe 200 newspaper articles and found exactly what I wanted in those articles to explain what was going on at that mental hospital and why the press was not allowed there for 2 days and only visitation there afterwards. And I went through as much time would allow this week the comparisons to Jonestown and certain similarities of names and broken those down, and the medical school that was the excuse for the invasion and the role of Dr. Peter Bourne with Jimmy Carter. I talked about that last week, and then I broke it more carefully into detailed connections, and I'll give you just some of the outlines to get an overview of some parts of the story. There's a Georgia connection to this. Ronald Reagan doesn't go to play golf. He's at Camp David every weekend, and he knew he was going to invade before he went down. They'd made the decisions to do it early in October, and as I said before, either on 15th or 16th at the time of the World Series. So why did he go down to Georgia? When Reagan was governor of California, that Garden plot to take over the government with the military, the government behind the government was based in Atlanta, Georgia. And Dr. Peter Bourne works in Atlanta, Georgia, out of Atlanta, Georgia, with Jimmy Carter. And that germ control center, which can be a terrible front for germs to be released in experimentations. And Jeffrey Bourne, the father of Peter Bourne, the doctor, works in Atlanta, Georgia, or did until he went to be director of the medical school down there in Grenada. And he worked on primates, a special center of primates. And I think of how Jim Jones allegedly got his money by selling these little monkeys around Indiana. And at the time, if you play back my tape on Jonestown, I asked how many little monkeys did Jim Jones sell before he had his buses and vans and was touring all over the United States with all this money. It came from somebody's monkeys. And also Dr. Delgado, who did the experimentations and mind control work from Yale and Navy intelligence, worked with these primates and these monkeys. So Daddy Bourne, Jeffrey Bourne, was into the primates before he ran this medical school down there. And these guys are from Georgia. And also Lockheed, and Lockheed is the big conduit, along with the Hughes organization, which ties together for espionage activity through Mr. Khashoggi and the various, remember Thane Caesar from Lockheed, who shot the fatal shots at Robert Kennedy's back of his ear. Georgia is a key pivotal place for military intelligence and for the second government, the government behind the government. So that Ronald Reagan was in Georgia when all of this was taking place as a Georgia connection. There's also a London connection. The attorney that for Mr. That set up Jonestown, Tim Stone, went from Stanford University, and Stanford Research was involved in Jonestown, and went to London to pick up the money that began the leasing of Jonestown. Mr. Bishop, who was killed, was an attorney educated in London before he returned to Grenada, so they knew his charm, his quality, his charisma. They knew him well in London, where Mr. Carrington from London was to go down to Barbados and set up the machinery with Herr Kissinger to get rid of Bishop. John Reese came over here. He was part of MI5, military intelligence, British intelligence. He came over from London in 1962 to latch on to Senator Larry MacDonald, Representative Larry MacDonald and Western Goals, and he and Louise Reese, she'd worked with Senator Joe McCarthy and the far right wing, and John Reese writes for the John Birch Society. He came from London. Mark Lane in 1964 went to London to write his book, Rush to Judgment. And Mark Lane has put down all the other researchers. If you saw him on Nightline, a friend has sent for the transcript. They asked him, well, after 20 years, Mark, Ted Koppel says, who do you think killed Kennedy? And Mark Lane says, well, if you go to the grassy knoll, there's a puff of smoke, and everyone ran to the grassy knoll. Mark Lane was bonded to the grassy knoll. I think when his mother delivered him, they must have been the grassy. Oh, I shouldn't say that. Okay, Mark Lane. I'll get the transcript and read it to you if you didn't see Nightline. He's bonded to the grassy knoll. Time stands still for Mark Lane. 20 years, he's on the knoll, okay? He went to London, and the introduction to his book was by Hugh Trevor Roper of MI6, the British counterintelligence, the one who identified falsely the information in Hitler's bunker and swore that the new diaries of Adolf Hitler's were accurate. Hugh Trevor Roper of British intelligence wrote the introduction, it's on the cover and so forth and inside, of Mark Lane's book. He didn't write in the United States. He went to London to work with British intelligence. And as I say, Jonestown was set up in 1973-74. The United States government put up money, but the basic money came from London, going to London. And so that there's a lot of interesting connections in this geographical area, because Mark Lane, you see, again, is down in Jonestown when these 914 people are killed. I marked out for the article I'm doing the years 1976 to 77 when George Bush was director of the CIA, in 1978 and 79 when Jonestown was at height. 1976 to 77 was when they're getting ready to move them down there. And Jonestown was going full swing, and the medical school was set up in Grenada in 1976-77 by Dr. Peter Bourne from Atlanta and London, and Jeffrey Bourne from Atlanta and London down there. And then something happened to the plans that were going so well in Grenada, where Mr. Gairy, Gairy, the fascist goon squad leader, was in power since the 50s. There was a coup there in 1979, March of 79, when Maurice Bishop took over. The people had enough of the maitre d', who became the managing governor, who is now going to come back into office there with his goon squad, the Mongoose Group, a terrorist group that will be put in by our CIA again. In March of 79, Maurice Bishop, the brilliant lawyer, became the head of Grenada, and in January 79, Jonestown was completely splattered. It ended in November 78. And Jonestown collapsed, and the CIA and Mr. Brzezinski and Jimmy Carter and Peter Bourne and the whole cabinet of Ronald Reagan had to keep quiet. Peter Bourne worked with the health education and welfare and the drug and mental problems. Well, they were all down in Jonestown, mentally sick, the drugged, and you name it, but no mention in their bio of trying to work on that. And then in 1980, that same time period, right after that, Frank Nugent was murdered and the Guggenheim Bank collapsed. So that the money operations for the murders, for the CIA, for the intelligence system folded or were diverted because the Jonestown thing broke like a big cancer bursting open, and Frank Nugent was gone with the links to the intelligence community. I noted a lot of similarities between Jonestown and Grenada. In Jonestown, there were 400 bodies. The first count, they actually counted 400 bodies. And then, lo and behold, there were 914. In Grenada, there were these graves and large, and they're mass graves also, the Jonestown people. In Grenada, a driver of a truck who took the bodies there, took an American official to these graves where there were 100 to 200 people. And then, lo and behold, after these news articles come out that there are these graves, first it's 100, then it's 200, then they say, well, no, there's nobody there. There were just 4 people. Now, that's impossible. It's a numeral problem in reverse. One, there's too few, and then they have doubled the amount, which I think fled out and then were brought back and had to be killed, and that's why the body count doubled. In Jonestown, in this case, they couldn't come up with the body count because there were too many people, and Ronald Reagan had said we went in without killing one civilian. Now, the mental hospital had 180 patients, and allegedly 50 were killed, which leaves 130, and 30 to 40 wandered off. About 30 wandered somewhere. And several articles had that story. That would leave about 100, which would be, if they all had to be dead before the Americans came in, they could be in that mass grave because the story of the murders didn't appear for 6 days, and it only broke because somebody in the Barbados said something in Canada, and Ronald Reagan had been documented to say there were no civilians. Now, Maurice Bishop gave a speech in 1980, which he said the CIA and these mercenaries, these hired killers, think of us as animals. We're not people, we're animals. They'll kill us like animals. And that's what Hitler did with the mentally sick and the crippled and the people that he didn't like, if they weren't the right shape or religion. So in this case, there's 180 people in the mental hospital. And as I mentioned earlier on the talk show, and repeat now, the Americans had helicopters flying over that building, and they invaded in the morning, early in the morning, and the helicopters flew over this particular mental hospital, according to the nurses or people there, the orderlies, and no doctor from there has been interviewed, which is interesting. Nobody in conjunction with that flew over there, and several times. Then in the afternoon, when Mr. Schoon, the man who's now running the island and the martial law, was on the American Army ship with the United States Army, they gave orders to the Navy to bomb the hospital, and 4 bombs fell plunk on that building. And the excuse for saying we didn't know anybody was there was that they said they went by there and there was no commotion. Well, wouldn't you want to know, if you gave orders to bomb a place, wouldn't you want to see if there's a sniper or somebody injured, or get somebody to a hospital, or see if you're going to be shot in the back? So this hospital, the people that were there, for some reason, I believe, were objects of experimentation. Ronald Reagan did that at the Topanga. He wanted to do it with Jolly West when he was governor in Topanga Canyon. There was an empty night base, and I have the correspondence and the documents in Jolly West and the UCLA doctors. These very refined, known doctors living in Los Angeles and prominent in the I guess at the faculty of the university, were going to take people from California prisons and put electrodes in their heads, and children of minorities, children of blacks and Indians, and see why they're violent and so forth. So if you can do that, right in Los Angeles with a faculty like that, and the governor of California is giving the go-ahead to Mr. Stubblebine or Dr. Jolly West. And if the governor's your president now, Jimmy Carter and Ronald Reagan, all these people are capable and were capable of mind control experiments on these particular islands. And it may be that when the government changed hands and Mr. Bishop maybe was ordered to stay away, I don't think the mayor of Beverly Hills went to the UCLA hospital. I don't think the head of the Westwood Chamber of Commerce knew. So maybe Mr. Bishop didn't know when the government changed hands. Maybe they had to unload all these people because of the horrendous scandal, and that you couldn't know their condition because it turns out that a U.S. Army official took the man who drove the truck and said, dig them out, we've got to get all the bodies out. Now, the similarity to Jonestown is that Mr. Brzezinski gave orders to take off all the identifying tags of the people who were dead. That's from the National Security Council. The orders came, and Brzezinski was lauding the invasion here that's just a stone's throw from Jonestown, and goodness knows what was in the mental hospital. We'll take a 1-minute break and then get back to some more on the story of what's going down at the Grenada Hospital, because I think it's a lot we can discuss on that matter. We're going to go to side 2 of this broadcast. It's number 623, November 14th, 1983. I may say next week is the anniversary, less one night, of the assassination of John Kennedy, but don't expect me to do a whole hour on it. Everything I do has to do with the people who killed John Kennedy. It goes back to those days. So in honor of John Kennedy, it's a continuous expose. As I said many times, we don't need a particular night. Now, when the U.S. Army came into Grenada, they were in charge of this whole operation. And that's a similarity to Jonestown. It was a Defense Department operation that took the bodies to Dover, Delaware, and the Defense Department made the decision, no newsmen, nobody for 2 days, nobody can see what we could do. And yet the gentleman who arrested Mr. Bishop, the prime minister, he was at the hospital that day before it was bombed. Mr. Schoon was in touch with the hospital that day. The Americans evidently knew what they were bombing. They bombed it, and then they ordered dispose of it, and the bodies are missing. Now, there's no account of where they are any more than we know who the 80 Americans were on the airplane flying over Korean Airline with Larry McDonald. There are questions to ask. There aren't many answers coming along. I also made a chronology of what was happening just before the Grenada invasion. An interesting thing that I went back and cross-filed was what I had on the air 2 weeks ago, the speech of Henry Gonzalez before Congress, September the 15th, 1983. And I took about 8 or 10 key sentences that he had in that speech that we shared on the air, and each one of them applies to the exact story of Grenada and how Grenada fell down, and how he referred to Henry Kissinger and Carrington Associates as a hired gun. And he asked the question, this is just 1 month before the planned invasion of the island, does the State Department lease out its own State Department to Kissinger-Carrington Association? And that's interesting because Mr. Carrington was the gentleman from Great Britain who went down to Barbados to set up the organization in 1980 that would get rid of Mr. Bishop when Bishop was elected in 1979. So our State Department is indeed contracted out. And William Clark, the National Security Advisor, was the person that hired Henry Kissinger, according to Representative Gonzalez, in August 1983 to be on the Kissinger Commission in Central America. And William Clark is the person that Maurice Bishop went to see in June 1980. Now, he went to him in 1980. Nobody has an embassy there. We wouldn't recognize him. We wanted to starve him out. He's a Marxist. We can't have a Marxist anywhere on the planet Earth. Mr. Bishop went to see William Clark in June of 1980. And in August, Clark assigns Henry Kissinger to Central America. Thank you, Mr. Bishop, and up yours. Come on in, Henry. We got a problem on our hands. Okay, in comes Henry and his business partner, Mr. Carrington, who Representative Gonzalez wants to investigate. They rub their two hands together like a match and make the world safe for organized crime. And watch and see. I heard one story. They're making the island safe for Mr. Robert Vesco. But with Mr. Gairy running and being able to come back and run for elections. As I say, the maitre d' of a nightclub who ran it like Batista ran Cuba all those years before Fidel Castro came in. It makes one more island safe for the Vescos and the organized crime syndicates, and then the Kissinger-Carrington gang can bring in the hashish from Lebanon and from their pal, the Jamals, and all over the world, and make one more island safe for dope and drug traffic. That's wherever Henry goes, whether it's Iran or Southeast Asia or Bolivia or Pakistan, Middle East, the drugs flow into the United States. Kissinger and Carrington associates. Check out what happens to that island now. So I did a chronology of what took place when Mr. Bishop was first taken away and removed, and then up to the time he was killed, the planned invasion, how Ronald Reagan planned it for a long time, and the excuses he made, and the tragedy of Mr. Bishop visiting Mr. Clark. Now, there's an example, a perfect example of what I'm trying to say about somebody being around Larry Flynt like Gordon Novell and Mitchell Werbel. If I were Bishop, I would no more go to William Clark. I would tell the United Nations what they did to Allende. I would list the 77 countries, the military dictatorships, the people that have been murdered to put the current people into power, the murder of Sadat, the murder of the president of South Korea. This was before Aquino was killed, the John Kennedy, the overthrow in Chile. I would present to the world court of some kind how the murderers are swinging in Washington and how they're escalating their murders. I wouldn't ask William Clark for a favor. With a track record like that, you don't go ask them for a favor. By the time he walks out the door, they have a circle on his coat and it's marked with a target. And it's just that simple. You don't ask for favors. It's like this last week, Coretta King had to cancel speech because there was a death threat on her life. Jesse Jackson asked for protection because there was a death threat on his life. Where were Coretta King and Jesse Jackson when Martin Luther King was murdered? Where were they when the House Select Committee was investigating their work, or Robert Byron Watson? Where were these people? Or Andrew Young? He's not threatened because he plays their game with them down the line. But the minute they step out and get a little too rambunctious or get a Martin Luther King Day, then she can't go public anymore. Her life's in danger. Well, they asked for it because they didn't help the researchers. They haven't helped us. They haven't written the introduction to a book. They've never picked up a phone and wanted to know who killed Martin. So what makes Jesse Jackson think he's safe? He's just a fool. He's like the Jews that walked into the oven at Auschwitz. They saw their tailor go and their shoemaker go, and then next it was the Jewish butcher, and then it was the banker. What made the banker think that he was any safer? It's like the movie, the Uffizi Continis in Italy, this wealthy family of Jewish people who let the poor Jews who can't go to the colleges and schools be educated play tennis in their home because they have their own private tennis court, and you can't use the tennis courts in Italy because the Nazis are there and you're Jewish. So finally, in the end of the movie, if you didn't see it, if ever it comes around, see it, the Uffizi Continis are put on the wagons and trains and sent to be burned in the same ovens as the people that they let use their tennis courts. The mistake of Bishop with the track record of the United States is you don't go up there and ask for mercy at all. You just simply tell the world what's going on, and you don't mingle with these people, and you don't mess around with any part of them because they're death incorporated, murder incorporated, and you stay away from them. If they come and get you, it's one thing, but you don't ask them for favors. That's the way I feel. If they want to come and get me, I'm not inviting them, but I wouldn't mingle with the likes of these people. And I stay far away, and I don't want to have anything to do with them. It taints anything I think or feel, and I feel very strongly about that. And the same way with Maurice Bishop. Why should you go to Washington and ask William Clark? Ask William Clark about Helene von Damme in Austria, what she's doing in Vienna, or her German husband down at La Paz, Bolivia, and the death squads in Bolivia. And Mr. Maurice Bishop would know that he'd be in a coffin. It was June when he was there, and by October he's dead. Why doesn't he do a little investigative work? These heads of states are so busy, with some things that are going on. You need a little researcher on the side. Well, I did an outline of the history of Grenada this week. As I say, I went through every aspect that I want to write about the early Grenada from 1951 when Sir Eric Gairy, Gairy, he started as a maitre d' at the Evening Palace nightclub in 1951 took over the Grenada Labor Party, and he had this death goon squad, the secret police called the Mongoose Gang. They're still going. Mr. Bishop, Maurice Bishop, was beaten up by them, and Maurice Bishop's father was murdered by these police in demonstrations. There were anti-Gairy demonstrations in 1974. That's the same year that London and Tim Stone and Stanford Research were funding getting ready to rent Guyana for Jim Jones and his money from the primate sales to take these people down there and drug them out of their heads and then eventually to kill 914. Well, Sir Eric Gairy was a nightclub maitre d' when he was head of the Labor Party in 1951, the height of Batista in Cuba. Castro comes in shortly after, but down in this island was Mr. Gairy, was still British. And by 1973, he still has his Mongoose Goon Squad, Death Squad. They beat up Mr. Bishop, and then his father, as I say, was murdered by the police. They named a civic building the jail of the City Hall after his father, and that's where Maurice Bishop was taken off when he was to be murdered. Demonstrations in 1974. Where is Sir Eric Gairy? I read in the New York Times this week that he can run for office again back in Grenada. That's the little jewel of a democracy that we're so proud of, okay? Then I did some more outlining on Peter Bourne and his activities with Mr. Brzezinski and the administration when Jimmy Carter was in, when Jonestown was at its height. Interesting, after Bishop was elected in March 17, 1979, Mr. Gairy goes in 1979 to Peter Bourne. Peter Bourne is the man who was on Jimmy Carter's cabinet position, helped with the drug program and with mental health and so forth. He's the man with that background I've explained to you from Agent Orange and the the AID in Vietnam with the Special Forces. And then he works in the White House with Mr. Keogh, with the White House plumbers, and Richard Nixon, Keogh, Mr. Keogh, part of the Nixon gang. Then he's with Jimmy Carter and puts Jimmy Carter in as a front for Brzezinski and Nelson Rockefeller and the Trilateral. He bridges both administrations, the Nixon administration, Peter Bourne does, and then the Jimmy Carter. Then he goes on to the United Nations in a water control group. It's called the UN Water group, but his offices are down in Washington, D.C., where he works with the World Bank. And I mentioned last week that Lawrence Mann of Jonestown, the liaison of Guyana to Washington, D.C., who lived with the alleged Mata Hari, the two of them were murdered the day after the invasion of Grenada. They were both involved with Jonestown. Well, Mr. Mann worked in Washington, D.C. at the World Bank the same time that Peter Bourne had his offices in Washington, D.C., and the Carter administration was behind and supported the entire Jonestown operation and covered it up 100% after 914 deaths. The Birch Society and the far right keep crying about the Soviet Union and the airplane that went down over there. Why don't they check out, in terms of hypocrisy, the 914 deaths and the material in Washington that conceals those American citizens also. There were 86 on the other plane and 914 in Guyana. So Peter Bourne worked in Washington, D.C. His cover was the UN Water Group, and he worked with the World Bank in Washington, D.C. at the same time that Lawrence Mann was at the World Bank, and he was the liaison of Guyana to Washington, D.C. And the day after Grenada's overthrown, Mann and his Mata Hari, his woman from Jonestown, that she had several names that she used, they're both dead, and I mentioned those last week. So as soon as Bishop is in, the plans were made to kill him. He gave a speech in Grenada. There was a bomb in the park that injured a lot of people there. It's in June of 1980 at the Queen's Park, where Maurice Bishop was talking, and they were having speeches, and they had gotten Gairy out. He had been in government just a short while. And Sir Eric Gairy had gone to the United Nations, to Peter Bourne, and he went to Jimmy Carter, and he says, help me get rid of this Maurice Bishop. Here's this refined, intelligent lawyer from London who now has the government in Grenada, and here's Sir Eric Gairy from the Moonshine nightclub, or you have what, with the Goon Squad. And when he loses that, when there's this coup and the people kick him out, he goes to Peter Bourne, the same Bourne whose father and he are running the medical school on Grenada, and says, help me. And Peter Bourne refers him to Mr. Califano, who, working for Jimmy Carter, is now head of health, education, and welfare. But Mr. Califano was in the Pentagon long before that. Mr. Califano worked with Alexander Haig at the time of the Bay of Pigs. He was the assistant to the secretary of the Defense Department. He worked with Henry Kissinger. He worked with Fritz Kramer, the advisor, the Army's chief of staff. Mr. Califano takes a role from working with the Army to going to, under the other administrations when Kennedy was murdered and the Bay of Pigs people were involved in killing Kennedy. Califano works for Jimmy Carter at Health, Education, and Welfare. And lo and behold, who shows up but this fellow from Grenada who's been kicked out, who goes to Califano and Peter Bourne and says, hey, get that bishop out of the way. Now, we've got this medical school set up with 700 people. George Bush was the CIA director when the medical school was set up. Peter Bourne goes down there to teach. His father is the director of the medical school. This goon squad has been kicked out. Sir Eric Gairy, they've been kicked out. The Mongoose Group. He goes right to the UN where Peter Bourne is, whose offices are in Washington with the World Bank, with Mr. Mann from Guyana. I didn't say it's the same office building, but the same organization, and both working for this group. And Gairy says, help me get out. And sure enough, Mr. Carrington and Mr. Kissinger go right to Barbados to set up an organization that will be the excuse to overthrow the island and make it safe for the Catholic Church that had their masses yesterday, and for the people on the island, not the native population necessarily, a lot of them, but the powers that be, Kissinger and Carrington. And as I say, Mr. Maurice Bishop has visited Clark, who appoints Henry Kissinger, and the wheels are rolling. Now, Bishop had warned at rallies when they got Gairy out. They had rallies at the park, and he had several speeches, and I have copies of those. One in March 13th, 1980, 1 year after he was in. Came in March 1979. 30,000 people were gathered and proclaimed, they were satisfied with him. In fact, they still like him. He had a lot of charisma. And those people aren't being interviewed, you notice, on the news and TV. In June 1980, he gave a speech at the park when that bomb went out. As I mentioned earlier, these people, these mercenaries, and those are the mercenaries of the Nugan Hand, the anti-Castro Cubans, the Michael Townleys that killed Orlando Letelier and Ronnie Moffat when Bush was director of the CIA, and Allende helped with Allende and these many murders. I had some of them there last week. He said America's imperialist, there's going to be intervention, they're going to take over what we're doing. And that's what he said in 1980, 3 years ago. But the machinery was already set up now to move him out within 3 years. In August of 1980, he told the U.S. president that Grenada is importing problems for me, and they responded by saying that Grenada is importing violence and torture, and that it's a very dangerous island, and it's threatening the security of the United States. And he warned about the mercenaries and the cruelty of the people that are bombing 80 people in a park and so forth and so on. So while he's trying to make the go of the government, the unemployment's gone from 40% to 14%. He's trying to get some education and health plans. Mr. Bishop was a target from the day that he got Mr. Gairy out. And Bishop is dead and Gairy is in. Now, in March of this year, Ronald Reagan gave a speech. In 1983, Grenada is jeopardizing the national security of the United States. And then he escalates that with a picture of the map, that airport map, and the dangers of the map. Well, it turned out it wasn't any danger at all, and the man who built it said there is nothing at all to indicate that that airport is a danger to the United States. Now, the medical school is the part that interests me because of the secrecy that went on in the island. There was obviously described as the biggest secret news blackout in the history of the United States. You're talking about an island of 100,000 people. You have Jeffrey Bourne, not Eric Bourne, and his father, Jeffrey and Peter Bourne, the two doctors, going back and forth with communications to the United States. They found it safe enough to put a medical school with 700 Americans, or mostly Americans, going to college on the island. How much terrorism or damage was happening there? They could put that medical school on any island they wanted. And it was plunked down there. They wouldn't send an ambassador down there. Jimmy Carter had an ambassador that went 2 times. Now listen to the inconsistency of this. He is the President of the United States 4 years. There's a medical school run by his cabinet member and his cabinet member's wife, Mary Bourne, and Peter Bourne allegedly were the brains behind picking Jimmy Carter. Of course, they were the front for the trilateral and Brzezinski. But Peter Bourne he's on the cabinet of Jimmy Carter. He flies down there all the time to the school. His father runs a school of 700 Americans. Would you think that Jimmy Carter would find it sufficient to send an ambassador there just to know how Peter's family is doing, or Mary's family, or if there's Russians or Libyans, or if Castro's going to take the island over? Wouldn't you think that Jimmy Carter would have some interest with his direct cabinet people that have handpicked him for president, who are running a medical school, and he has no ambassador down there and won't send one? Just 2 trips. And then when Ronald Reagan is president, he has none. So for 2 days, the Pentagon said yes. The admiral said yes. We said nobody can enter this island, anyone, for 2 days. And after that, it turned out that everything they said, every news story they gave, was a massive lie. Well, why would the president, at time of re-election, with all the other scandals going around him, with the Reagan Carter debate papers, the Johnny Carson papers, the Frank Sinatra, the Paul Laxalt, the mob connections, the Alfred Bloomingdale connection, all these things coming down around this man, why in the world would he want to put one more thing in his stumbling block to not allow them to come to that island? Now, the secrecy was a clue, and the hospital, the medical school run by the Bournes, was another clue to me. Now, after 2 days of this news blackout, Barbados, that had 400 newsmen waiting there for a story, were blacked out. I have articles that the Barbados news kept a lie. They'd say, we're going to have a press conference in the afternoon. It didn't happen. We'll have one in the evening. It didn't happen. The Barbados held the line of the press, and after the second day, press could come to Grenada for the day on specific places that they could see, then were flown back to Barbados. We are told if you visit the Soviet Union, you can only go to certain places. You're not at liberty to go all over. They select where you go. Tell me what is the difference between the Soviet Union and the United States when you take people from Barbados and you handpick who you take, and they photographed everything of the medical school kissing the ground, American arrival and all that. But nobody can be there, and they selected where they could go. One newsman from Barbados did get to that bombed-out hospital, told it to McLean in Canada, and 6 days later, after the president said there's no casualties, no civilian casualties on the island, they say, well, bombs fell on a hospital, on a mental hospital, and there were as many as possibly 50 dead, and they didn't explain where the other 130 are. And so there was a secrecy that there had to be a reason, and the first target was the mental hospital. They landed in the morning. They began their invasion of the island, and by 2 o'clock, 4 bombs had fallen on the mental hospital. There was this total news blackout, and then October 31st, they start to let the news on, and the president with no civilian casualties. Now, I started different file folders the first day, how the hospital was bombed, and they didn't admit that we dropped not one bomb by mistake, but 4 over there. Then 6 days later, they admit, yes, there's a mental hospital, and we bombed it because the story broke in Canada. The next point is that the heads of the hospital, the ones who were interviewed, said that they were told by the government officials, release the patients and arm them, lock some up, lock the men up, lock these people up, release others, give them weapons, post them in the vicinity of the building, and they become part of the army. What kind of a mental hospital is it where the patients get the guns and become the army over there? And then some of the victims immediately were cremated, the coroner said, and some were buried on the spot. And the hospital was right at the edge of the fort, right at the fort, 200 yards from the government's mansion. Mr. Schoon, who was rescued by the United States government and was kept in custody of the U.S. government, was in their custody at the time when the Army gave the Navy the orders, go and bomb that place, and they bombed the mental hospital, and they had been over it with helicopters earlier in the day. According to the nurse, they were flying over there constantly. Now, General Hudson, Hudson, Hudson Aston, Auston, he was the man who had seized control of the island originally on October the 19th. One story is that he called the hospital himself and said, lock up all the males and then report for duty. So the people in charge of the mentally sick were to lock them up and report for duty, and he was on the USS Guam at the time, okay? Now, there's another article that says Judge Austin came to the hospital himself, that it was important that he be there, so that Mr. Austin, the man in charge of Mr. Maurice Bishop, and also Mr. Schoon, who became the head of Grenada after the invasion, were actually involved in what was to happen at the hospital, and they warned the personnel to get out. Now, in Jonestown, there were passports for 1,200 people. There were 914 dead. There were members of Congress that testified, and articles written that 120 of the hard killers got away, including the yacht that belonged to Jim Jones that went to Barbados. So in this story of the body count and the discrepancies in the body count, there are similarities to Jonestown, and also in the people telling the officials running it what to do. In other words, the people that had those patients locked up, that had to be wiped out, were protected and didn't die. They were warned. Some were told to go home. Now, the U.S. military, when Larry Speaks was asked about, the military was asked, what about the hospital? They said they didn't know what the building was, even though it was under surveillance, and they said they didn't go in because they didn't hear any sound. Well, if the personnel were reported up for duty and they were saved, what kind of sounds would you want? You might listen for a sniper, as I mentioned earlier. You might look to see if somebody's dying in there. You might look to see what it was you bombed, but they didn't want to. And one of the explanations was the hospital is empty because they moved to another house. What house has 100 mental patients in Barbados? I'd like to know if all those people were killed or they're in some other house. Then another version was that the Grenadians are buried on the spot. The reason they didn't know what it was is that they buried them the moment they were dead. They don't have funerals. Do they have families in Barbados, in Grenada rather, or are they taken like Jonestown? And didn't the people, many of them that were dead, didn't match the passports? Who in the world was taken to this hospital in Grenada, and what was the hurry? Didn't the families have the right to any funeral? Did they have services? They're Catholic and Anglicans, and they have services, and if a member of the family is legitimately mentally sick and is on an army base or for whatever mental hospital, they weren't taken to the families. With a population of 180, they could identify them by name. So there was this explanation that they had to be buried right on the spot or right away, and only 6 days later admitted it then by the Marines saying, we didn't go in the site. I see no evil, I hear no evil. I didn't go in there, so I don't know what was there. That's absolutely impossible that you take an island, go way off in the woods, and you don't even look at the building. Then Larry Speaks gave a press conference for Ronald Reagan and said there's a religious custom on the island. You bury people as soon as they die. Then he retracted that and said no, a few days later, no, it's not a religious custom because these were Catholics and Anglicans. But the curiosity of the Americans, even a military duty, in case one person was alive, is outrageous, and particularly since it was on an airstrip and they were supposed to be protecting the airstrips. Now, November the 7th, 1983, 100 bodies were found in a mass grave, and then later an American official who went with a truck driver asked them to please help him dig up the grave, and he says that he went there and that they asked him to remove the bodies from the mass grave. And then the next story, first was 100 or 200 people, then the next story was there's no such grave, it didn't exist. Then there was another story that they were thrown into the sea, the bodies were thrown into the sea. So were there 200 people? There were about 68 that were gunned down in the crowd when Maurice Bishop was killed. Were 100 killed? The president says no civilians. And that's just one of the lies. But the proximity to Jonestown is very important because Jonestown flew people to hospitals around those islands, broken arms or broken legs or for whatever purposes, and got them away from there. The New York Times has a full-page article this last Sunday, I think it was November the 6th, on all the lies and contradictions of the Reagan administration. And I'll detail some of them with you because the hour is up now. We just have 1 minute to go on this program. I'll do more on the medical school and more in the hospital, but I'm convinced that because of the discrepancies in the hospital story and the massive bombing and the importance it was to the people who kidnapped Maurice Bishop and who run the government now, that they were in touch with that hospital at that time, that hospital had more importance, just as Jonestown had, to the necessity for the secrecy. The plan to take the island was done as early as 1979 when Bishop won. But the secrecy of getting rid of those bodies had to be done because a new government was in and they were going to put in the old goon squad and clean out this hospital. Well, that's all the time we have. We'll do more on that and other news next week. This is Mae Brussell, and it's KAZU FM in Pacific Grove. You behave yourselves, and I'll be back with you next week.